27th of October, 1946, the Firth of Clyde, Scotland. A grey morning presses low over the water, and the air smells of brine and engine oil. On the shipway at John Brown's shipyard in Clydebank, 10,000 people have gathered in the cold. Journalists, dignitaries, dock workers, and their families pressed together in silence, breath rising in small clouds above their heads. Then, slowly, almost impossibly, something begins to move. She slides into the water like a cathedral falling sideways. 44,500 tons of British steel, armour plate, and engineering ambition displacing the Clyde in a wall of white foam. At 248 metres in length, longer than 16 double-decker buses placed end to end, HMS Vanguard is the largest, most powerful warship ever completed by the Royal Navy. She is, by any measure, the most capable battleship Britain has ever produced. German naval planners had insisted, in the early years of the war, that building such a vessel in the timeframes demanded was not merely difficult, it was impossible. The metallurgy alone would defeat the British yards. The fire control systems would never integrate. The guns, 4 twin 15-inch turrets, each barrel capable of hurling a shell weighing nearly 900 kilograms over 22 miles, would shake themselves apart in the first broadside. They were wrong on every count. What makes Vanguard remarkable is not merely her scale, though that alone would be extraordinary. It is the accumulated wisdom she represents. Decades of British naval engineering, lessons paid for in blood and steel at Jutland, in the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, distilled into a single, devastating hull. She is the end of an era and the summit of it simultaneously. To understand what she meant, you must first understand the world that made her necessary. By 1939, Britain faced a naval problem that had no comfortable solution. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and the London Naval Treaty of 1930 had throttled battleship construction for over a decade. The Royal Navy's capital ships, the Queen Elizabeths, the Revenges, the Nelsons, were aging. Worse, they were known to be aging. German naval intelligence understood British tonnage limits, British construction rates, British material constraints. When the Kriegsmarine began laying down the Bismarck class, ships displacing over 50,000 tons at full load, armed with 8 38-centimetre guns, British planners were confronted with an uncomfortable arithmetic. The Royal Navy needed a ship that could absorb punishment the Bismarck could deliver, and return fire with sufficient weight of broadside to settle the matter decisively. The existing King George V class, fine ships by any standard, carried 10 14-inch guns, powerful, but the 14-inch shell, at its maximum weight, reached roughly 721 kilograms. The Bismarck's 38-centimetre shell reached approximately 800 kilograms. The margin was uncomfortable. What Britain needed were 15-inch guns. The problem was time. Designing and manufacturing new 15-inch turret systems from first principles would require years. Years that the deteriorating situation in Europe simply would not provide. New gun barrels, new mountings, new training mechanisms, new fire control integration. Each element represented a chain of engineering decisions that took time to test, time to refine, and time to produce in quantity. War waits for no production schedule. The solution, when it arrived, was elegant in the way that only genuinely desperate pragmatism can be elegant. Britain had 15-inch guns already. She had rather a lot of them, sitting in storage, preserved against exactly this kind of contingency, were the twin 15-inch turret assemblies originally fitted to the battle cruisers HMS Courageous, HMS Glorious, and the light battle cruisers Furious and, crucially, 2 spare turrets held in reserve from the Royal Sovereign class. The guns themselves dated from the First World War, but the barrels, the breeches, the loading mechanisms, all had been maintained with characteristically meticulous Royal Navy care. The question was whether old guns could be married to a new ship without compromise. The answer, it turned out, was not merely yes. It was emphatically yes. Design work on what would become Vanguard began in earnest at the Directorate of Naval Construction in Bath in 1940, under the supervision of Sir Stanley Goodall, the Director of Naval Construction. The challenge his team faced was not simply engineering a ship around existing turrets, it was engineering the finest possible ship, one that corrected every lesson the Royal Navy had absorbed at terrible cost in the preceding decades, and then fitting those existing turrets to it so seamlessly that no observer would know the guns predated the hull by 30 years. The hull itself was conceived on a scale that made even the King George V class look modest. Vanguard's beam, her width at the widest point, reached 32.9 meters. This was not mere ambition. Width meant stability. Stability meant accurate gunfire. Accurate gunfire, at ranges approaching 20 miles, was the difference between victory and catastrophe. The armor scheme drew directly from painful experience. At the Battle of the Denmark Strait in May 1941, HMS Hood, Britain's most celebrated warship, had been destroyed in under 3 minutes by plunging fire from Bismarck, shells arriving at steep angles and penetrating the relatively thin deck armor. Vanguard's designers specified deck armor reaching 152 millimeters in the thickest sections over the magazines. Her main belt armor, the vertical plate running along the waterline, reached 356 millimeters at its deepest. To put that in domestic terms, a standard British house brick is roughly 215 millimeters wide. Vanguard's main belt was wider than 1.5 bricks of solid cemented armor steel, running the length of her vitals. The 15-inch guns themselves, technically designated QF Mark I, though the designation somewhat undersells their vintage. Each barrel measured 19.05 meters in length and weighed approximately 101 tons. Each twin-turret assembly, with its barbette and magazine below, weighed in the region of 900 tons fully equipped. The propellant charges alone, each one roughly the size of a garden shed when assembled, drove those 879 kilogram shells to a muzzle velocity of 749 meters per second. The sound of a full broadside from all 8 guns has been described by witnesses as less a noise than a physical event. A pressure wave that stopped thought entirely for roughly a second and a half. The fire control systems were entirely new. British directors, rangefinders, and the Admiralty Fire Control Table Mark X were integrated into Vanguard's design from the outset, ensuring that the old guns spoke with entirely modern precision. Construction was divided among multiple facilities: the hull at Clydebank, armor plate supplied by Beardmores, and the Sheffield Steelworks, machinery components manufactured across the Midlands and Scotland. At peak construction, estimates suggest thousands of workers were engaged across the supply chain at any given moment, though wartime records make precise figures difficult to establish with confidence. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Vanguard was commissioned into the Royal Navy on the 9th of May 1946, after a construction period of approximately 4 years, remarkably swift for a vessel of her complexity. Her sea trials in the Firth of Clyde and later in the deeper waters off the Scottish coast revealed a ship that exceeded expectations in nearly every category. She achieved a top speed of 30.1 knots during trials. extraordinary for a vessel of her displacement, and faster than either of the Bismarck class by a meaningful margin. Her handling at speed drew particular praise from her first commanding officers, who noted that she responded to the helm with a precision that belied her size. She conducted what was perhaps her most visible operational role in February 1947, when she carried King George VI, Queen Elizabeth, and the Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret to South Africa, the royal family's first overseas tour since the outbreak of war. The symbolism was not subtle. Britain, battered and exhausted but undefeated, was sending its monarch to the Empire aboard the mightiest warship it had ever built. The message required no translation. During her active service, Vanguard participated in fleet exercises in the Mediterranean and Atlantic, operating in company with other NATO vessels and demonstrating the full reach of her armament in firing exercises. Exact results of her weapons evaluations remain partially classified, though accounts from officers who served aboard her consistently described the gunnery as exceptional. The integration of old guns and new fire control producing accuracy that surprised even those who had designed the system. The German Kriegsmarine, in its heyday, had produced formidable warships. The Bismarck and her sister Tirpitz displaced more than Vanguard on paper, roughly 50,300 tons at full combat load against Vanguard's 51,420 tons at deep load, figures close enough that the comparison is genuinely instructive. The Bismarck class carried 8 38-centimeter guns in 4 twin turrets, a main armament broadly comparable to Vanguard's 8 15-inch pieces, with the German shells outweighing the British by a modest margin. Where Vanguard held a decisive advantage was speed. Her 30-plus knots against the Bismarck's 30.1 knots was roughly matched, but Vanguard's fire control systems were demonstrably more sophisticated. The Kriegsmarine's fire control, though capable, as Hood's destruction proved, relied on optical range-finding that British radar-integrated systems had substantially surpassed by 1944. The Americans, meanwhile, had pursued a different philosophy entirely. The Iowa-class battleships, USS Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, Wisconsin, prioritized speed above all, achieving 32 to 33 knots at the cost of somewhat lighter armor than Vanguard's specification. The Iowa's main armament of 9 16-inch guns produced a heavier broadside weight, 9 shells versus 8, and each American shell heavier than the British 15-inch round. Whether the Iowa class was definitively superior to Vanguard is a question naval historians continue to contest, and honestly, it is a question without a clean answer. What is clear is that Vanguard represented the absolute summit of British battleship design, incorporating lessons learned across 2 world wars in a vessel that was, in the judgment of those who served in her, simply excellent. The concept of upgunning a modern hull with proven older armament was not widely imitated, in part because very few nations had the stockpile of suitable weapons to draw upon, and in part because the era of the battleship was visibly closing by the time Vanguard entered service. But the principle of integrating legacy weapon systems into new platforms through superior fire control and structural engineering has never lost its relevance. Vanguard's legacy is complicated by timing. She arrived in commission in May 1946, 1 year after the war in Europe had ended, 2 months before the atomic bomb test at Bikini Atoll rendered every existing naval calculation provisional at best. She was, in the most literal sense, the last of her kind, the last battleship completed by the Royal Navy, the last great gun platform in a tradition stretching back through HMS Victory to the Mary Rose. There would be no successor. She served through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, a diminishing asset in a navy reorganizing around carriers, submarines, and the new geometries of nuclear deterrence. In 1956, she was placed in reserve, and in 1960, after parliamentary debate that reflected genuine public ambivalence about losing so significant a vessel, she was sold for scrapping at Faslane. The process took several years. Some of her fittings survive in private collections and museums. A section of her armour plate is displayed at the National Museum of the Royal Navy in Portsmouth. No single shot fired in anger defines her, but that is not quite the point. Her significance lies in what she proved possible, that a nation under existential pressure, working within the constraints of wartime production, existing weapon stocks, and hard-won operational experience, could produce something not merely adequate, but genuinely outstanding. She was the answer to a question that the Germans had declared unanswerable. Return to that grey morning on the Clyde. The crowd has fallen entirely silent. The ship is moving now, gathering pace, the chains screaming against the steel of the slipway in a sound like tearing metal. When she strikes the water, the wave rolls outward across the river and washes against both banks simultaneously. Those 10,000 people standing in the cold, the dockers who riveted her together plate by plate, the engineers who threaded her electrical systems through compartments barely wide enough to turn in, the wives and children of men who had worked double shifts through the worst winters of the war. They are watching their own work float. They are watching years of effort become a ship. The German naval staff had filed their assessments. The metallurgy would defeat the British yards. The fire control would never integrate. The guns would shake themselves apart. The timeframes were impossible, the ambitions unrealistic, the whole enterprise a symptom of British strategic delusion. HMS Vanguard displaced 44,500 tons on launch day. She could steam at 30 knots. Her 8 15-inch guns could place a shell the weight of a small car onto a target 22 miles away, with a precision that existing naval gunnery had never achieved. She was armoured against the weapons of her age and fast enough to choose her engagements. She was built in 4 years, on time, under wartime conditions, from a design that solved problems other navies had not yet admitted existed. She was impossible. She was the Royal Navy's finest battleship. She was both of those things at once, and the Clyde received her without ceremony, without drama, because the men who built her had known all along exactly what she was.